Okay, we're going to get started. And today we are here to talk about risk management and crisis management. And I chose this one because this is an issue that's been getting a lot of discussion. You see it, we've been seeing a lot on the like Mich Leibel and some other discussion boards, ALA, United for Libraries. There's been some mentions of webinars. There are a couple webinars coming up that I'm going to put a note out on Mich Leibel so everyone can take them if you want to. And a lot of this is stuff that a lot of you probably already know and have been doing, but just maybe the terminology has changed a little bit. So this is really designed to be kind of an overview. Each of these, risk management and crisis management, are topics that could have multi-day classes. So this is really just meant to be kind of skimming the surface to give you a very brief introduction. At the end of my presentation, I have a lot of resources that you can access if you want to learn more, including some learning and training resources. If you want to, take a class or you want to get a training on it or have your staff get a training. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I always start with my disclaimer. If you don't know, my name is Claire Mambiella. I am the library law consultant for the Library of Michigan. I have a master's in library science and a JD, and my job is to help public libraries, and actually any library in the state of Michigan, navigate through legal issues, kind of understand them and know what their, provide information so they know what their options are, including talking to an attorney, which is always your preferred option when you're dealing with a legal problem. So when we're talking about risk and crisis management, what are they? Well, sometimes you see these terms used a little bit interchangeably, but in actuality, they are two different things, but they are related. So risk management is the process of identifying, mitigating, and navigating situations that could result in damage to library assets, staff, financial security, and reputation. So risk management is all about kind of the before, right? So it's about, identifying possible problems your library could face, from tiny problems to very large disasters. It's about, saying, okay, well, to put it simply, it's why you get insurance, right? So you look around, you say, well, what would happen if my ceiling caved in? What would happen if we had a flood? What would happen if our pipes froze? What would happen if someone in the library had a heart attack? What would happen if someone in the library embezzled money? All of these things are risk management situations that, you kind of take a look at and you think, okay, I have to prepare for this. So I have to identify and then I have to mitigate it, right? So risk management is about identifying and mainly mitigating. So prevention, doing what you can to prevent damage. So it's about, okay, how do I, prepare for a weather event? Or how do we prepare for a possible pandemic? Or how do we prepare for misbehavior by patrons? How do we prepare or mitigate crime? All of those are risk management. And a lot of times risk management is associated with insurance. A lot of insurance companies do risk assessments, will do like a risk audit, and part of what they want to do is sell you insurance. But a lot of them, they do a pretty good job at helping you identify what are some situations that you could be involved in that you might need to either prepare ahead of time, or you might need to come up with a crisis management plan or a disaster plan. So crisis management is about the, if risk management is about the identifying and the before of a disaster or a crisis, then crisis management is about the during the crisis, and about the aftermath of the crisis. How do you actually handle the crisis, and what do you tangibly do to prepare for a crisis, right? So we're going to be talking about, both of these. So what do both of these have to do with law, right? So I'm a library law consultant, and why am I talking about these? Well, I guess the quick answer is everything has to do with law, right? Law kind of permeates almost every part of your life. But the reason why I'm interested in this is that, when you have a good risk or crisis management plan, it really protects you, right? So if risk management is all about protection, well, it protects you against things like liability, right? So when you have good patron policies, right, that could be part of risk management, making sure that your policies are solid, are legal, are enforceable, and that your staff actually enforces them, and that you do all the things you can do to make sure that your patrons behave. Making sure your building is safe, all of those things. Good risk management helps prevent litigation, right? If you do everything you're supposed to do to protect people, and you follow the laws, and you're taking care of your responsibilities, then you have less liability if something were to happen. Then along the way, good plans, good risk management, and good crisis management plans along the way, as you're developing these, and you come up with holes in your organization that say, hey, our privacy policies are not exactly what they should be to be in compliance with the Library Privacy Act or the Identity Theft Act, or some of the other legislation that is being passed both federally and state to protect data and personal information. That's become a very big thing in legislatures, is protecting personal information. So we have to make sure, that if you find a hole in that while you're conducting your risk management, well, you need to make sure that that gets fixed, right? So you need to alter your policies, alter, maybe your equipment, to make sure that you're in compliance with those laws. Again, that limits your liability. Then workplace safety, right? So again, you're doing your risk management and you come across something in the library that could present a safety risk to staff. Maybe it's a shelf or a shelving unit that is loose. Maybe it's a bookcase that should be attached to the wall that is not. And if it were to fall or if it were to collapse, not only could it injure staff, but it could injure the public, and that can open up a whole bunch of different avenues of liability and risk for the library. So a lot of these things deal very strongly with law. Having a good plan can strengthen your policies and make sure your patrons comply, and make sure that your staff are properly enforcing. Training. All of this is going to have very heavy training components, right? So a good risk management plan and a good crisis management plan, both of them are going to entail lots of training. The more you train staff, the more that your policies empower staff, means that you're going to have better workers. You're going to have workers that are more knowledgeable about a wide range of things in the library. They're going to be more knowledgeable about policies and how to enforce policies and what they should be enforcing. They're going to be more knowledgeable with some of the legal requirements and standards that libraries have to comply with. And then lastly, having a really good risk management plan and a good crisis management plan can really foster trust between all of the stakeholders in a library, right? So if you have a really good risk management plan and a good crisis management plan and all of the things that go in that, so you've strengthened your policies and you've done what you can to make sure you're in compliance, that strengthens trust between not only the board and the director, because part of this process is making sure that the director has enough power and enough authority to do some things on the ground in a crisis without talking to the board. It also means making sure that maybe certain members of the library staff have the ability to make certain financial transactions in a crisis that they wouldn't normally have. So again, it can foster some trust and open up some new conversations between the board and the director, as well as the director and the staff and the community. And at the end of the day, if you have a good process, you've done your risk assessment, you've done your risk management, and then you have a good crisis management procedure, and then something happens, it could be a small thing or it could be, God forbid, a big thing, and you handle it well. That cements that trust among all those stakeholders, right? Among your community and among your staff and among your board and the director. So that's kind of what all of this is about. So it actually ties very heavily into law, lots of different laws. So an example of this that I came up with is when I first moved to Michigan, and this picture is a picture of my son when he was about 3. He is 20 now, and he's at MSU. We moved to Michigan when my kids were 5 and 3. And, we went to Meyer. And so I had these 2 little kids in Meyer, and the Meyer we go to is the Meyer outside East Lansing. So there's lots of, college students. So it's a pretty big Meyer. And I was getting, my son was little and we're in the store and he kept bugging me for, gum or for, the machine that gives you the little presents, the little prizes. And I kept saying, okay, when we get to checkout, when we're done our groceries. So then, we go through, we check out, and I'm in the line to check out, and all of a sudden I realize he's not there. He's nowhere to be seen. I cannot find my son. My daughter doesn't know where he is. Can't find him. He's little. We just moved there. So, of course, like any parent, I'm terrified. So I said to the person who's checking out the grocery, I said, have you, my son is gone. Well, the minute that this happened, the minute I mentioned that, okay, immediately, it seemed like immediate to me, a swarm of people were at that checkout. There were people in plain clothes. There were people in Meyer uniforms asking me, what did he look, what's his name? What does he look like? What was he wearing? How tall is he? And then immediately they made an announcement and all the doors to all of the Meyer shut. So they locked all the doors in the store and wouldn't let anybody in, wouldn't let anybody out. And then about 10 minutes later, something came over the radio that one of the Meyer employees had found him by the front of the store at the bubblegum machine, at the machine. So, but what obviously I was very happy that he was found, and everybody who has kids knows that horrible feeling of when they're gone. But what really struck me about this and what has stayed with me was this very organized response. It wasn't just the one person. It was all of a sudden the plainclothes security people, the other cash, the other people on the floor at Meyer were immediately, brought to that checkout where I was, immediately asking the right questions. And then they dispersed every corner of the store to look for him. And what I found out later is they do that for a certain amount of time. And if they don't find the child, they call the police. So, over the years, I've learned that this is actually a well-known process that retail has adopted over the years. And it was inspired by a tragic, something that happened in Florida where a 6-year-old was abducted from a Sears store and later found murdered. So they called it Code Adam, but they also call it Code Yellow. And in the Meyer I was in, that's what they did. They called it Code Yellow. So this is actually a good example of a risk in a crisis management. So what's the risk? The risk is lost kids, which happens all the time in retail. But the higher risk is kids, get abducted, right? So kids, all of a sudden, I think kids have always gotten abducted, but there became this national awareness of it. And the fact that, large retail stores are good places, if you are an abductor, to find kids who might be lost and separated, and you can get lost in the crowd. So the stores, helped by this national nonprofit, banded together and joined in on this one process, this risk management. So the risk management was the identification of the problem and the issue. And then the crisis management was the development of this program and this policy and procedure that hundreds of retailers throughout the world use. And so, that's a really good example of risk and crisis management. Plus, it gave me a chance to put a really cute picture of my kid up. Once they're 20, you don't get very many opportunities. So when we're talking specifically now about libraries, that was because that example was a little bit of a more, broader risk, although that code yellow could still work in a library, right? So if you're a very large library and you have kids that go missing, you can sign on to the Code Yellow or Code Adam program through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the Walsh Center. And they send you a kit with a description of the policy as well as stickers and all kinds of things. So first of all, let's talk about risk, right? So first we're going to talk about risk management. What is risk? Well, risk is the possibility that events could occur that could cause a negative outcome for the library or for people in the library, right? So it could cause injury or damage to things in the library. So it could be loss of health or life, could be loss of finances. So if you have embezzlement or you have a lawsuit, right? So that's a big one. Lawsuits are a big one, getting sued. It could be a loss of assets. Now, by assets, I mean everything in the library. So all the tangible things in the library, your building, your books, your book trucks, just everything in the library is your asset. And that can be either through disasters, accidents, and then there's the more intangible kinds of losses, which are things like loss of reputation, loss of trust in the community. And that's something that I think is a risk that a lot of libraries might not really think of in the same context as you may think of, bed bugs or workplace violence or data, a data breach, because it doesn't seem like a huge disaster. But, you could have all throughout the state, there are libraries that are having public disputes with boards or public disputes between staffs and boards or public disputes between the community and the library. And all of those kinds of things are also crises, which could cause damage and loss of reputation and loss of trust in the library. And why is that a bad thing, or why is that important? Well, what do you rely on when you do things like go for millages, right? Or you do fundraising, or you even try to recruit to get the best staff? You rely on your reputation, right? You rely on the idea that, well, everybody wants to work at X library, or we're not really worried about renewing our millage because our community loves us. So those are the kinds of things that may be like hidden risk that you might not always think about when you're talking in terms of like disaster plans and risk management. So if those are the risks, what causes these risks? Well, if you look at the experts and you look at like the risk assessment guides and the risk management guides, they kind of break risk into different categories. And one of the nicest ones I saw broke it into these three different categories. So you have natural risks, which fall into the category of like natural disasters, right? Whether pandemic and biologic, which could include things like pathological, which would be like viruses, but also like pests, like bed bugs or cockroaches or, lizards or, something else in the library. And then there's also like seismic and geologic problems, which are, earthquakes or sinkholes. You have human-initiated risks, which for libraries probably are the bulk of what we would consider crises. You have intentional acts, which would be things like crime, workplace violence, and crime includes not just violent crime or large theft, but it also includes things like the theft of IP, so someone peer-to-peer sharing in the library and you get the, cease and desist letters. things like cyber attacks, so data breaches, and then you have accidents, which are, injuries, things like heart attacks, overdoses. You have, again, bed bugs could be accident. I'm sure that most people don't intentionally introduce bed bugs to the library. And, you might have chemical releases. You could have, a cleaning service inadvertently, spill a very strong cleanser or mix cleansers that shouldn't be mixed. And then you have, of course, technological things like data breaches and a cyber attack, hardware failure. Your system could go down, your network system could go down. That could either be hardware or software. You could have a fire. You could have a mechanical breakdown. So your furnace could go out and your pipes could freeze. If depending on where your library is, if you have a sump pump, that could fail and your library could flood. You could have a power outage or a water outage, or you could have a structural issue either inside or on the exterior of your library. So all of these are things that cause risk. So those are the three main categories. Now, a risk assessment. When you're looking at your organization, you're saying, okay, I want to consider all of the risks in my organization. There's different ways to do this. There is, you can have an individual, like risk assessment for broken up for individual kinds of categories. For example, I want to look at, specifically pandemics. Or, there's a lot of libraries that a while ago established workplace violence risks, so shooters and, those kinds of things, employees with emotional issues who, may harm the workplace. So for a while, there's certain categories that, may come into the spotlight, and then businesses and libraries decide, okay, we're going to deal with that particular one and we're going to look at it. Right now, after what happened in Texas, a lot of people are looking at their electrical grid, right? So you're looking at your electrical system. What happens if the electricity goes out? And you assess things like different times of the year, and you assess the different things in your library that could be negatively affected by a loss in power. And then cybersecurity is also a very big one right now. As I said, there's a lot of laws that are starting to be passed in different states and at the federal level. There's a lot of liability for companies who misuse or don't properly secure personal information. So a lot of companies are looking at cybersecurity and the risk, doing risk assessments on their network security and their privacy processes. You can also do it by your asset, right? So you can look at your building. I want to do a risk assessment on my building. I want to make sure that it's in, good structural shape. I want to look at the possible things that could, harm it based on my, geographic location and the weather and its age. And, my municipality and the infrastructure. And, there's all different kinds of things you can look at it from that perspective. You can look the same thing as your technology. Okay, so as part of that, you could say, okay, well, we need to do a cybersecurity assessment, but we also need to look at other policy issues. We need to look at the public's use of our Wi-Fi for things like, IP theft, and some other kinds of privacy issues that don't have to do with cybersecurity. So we're just going to look at the technology as a whole rather than breaking it up into those other pieces. And then you can also look at, just looking at your library policies can be a risk assessment. Are our policies legal? Are our policies enforceable? Is our staff adequately and properly enforcing our policies? So there's lots of different ways you can look at a risk assessment, and it can easily get extremely overwhelming. So what is probably, and again, this is one of the things that some of it just depends on how individuals look at things, right? And your individual library, how big it is. And, so there's really isn't any one aspect to look at this from. And so I would recommend that you have a discussion with your insurance company, have a discussion with your board on how you would like to approach risk assessment. Maybe you just want to start with what are the most likely risks? What are those big things that are right in front of you? Have you already had something happen that, okay, we're going to start with that? Were we properly prepared? Are there other things we need to do? So when you're doing a risk assessment, there are essentially 5 steps that you follow. Now, as I said, there's different different groups out there that talk about risk assessment and how you do a risk assessment. There's different theories, but again, the one that I found that seemed to be pretty straightforward gives you 5 steps. You identify the hazard, and then you identify the assets the library has that could be vulnerable to that hazard. And then you analyze the impact of that hazard on the assets. So what is the impact? Is the impact damage? Is the impact death or destruction? What is the impact of that hazard on your assets? And then you come up with, okay, what is some mitigation? What can we do to prevent this impact if this hazard were to occur? And then once you work through those steps, the last step is now to maintain that risk assessment and revise it when necessary. So like everything else in the library, it's a constant, you keep it current. You have to constantly review it because risks change, right? How many of us, a year and a half ago, really seriously thought that a pandemic was going to be a serious risk? So it's something that you need to kind of be, constantly just tweaking and keeping an eye on. So this is kind of just a nifty graphic. This actually comes from FEMA. It comes from ready.gov, which has a really good explanation of risk assessments, and it's one of the best ones I've seen because it's in really plain language. I am not a risk assessment professional. I'm not an insurance person, and some of the language and some of the other risk assessment guides I saw was, I think you needed to be an MBA to really understand it. So I went with the ones that I personally thought made the most sense and were by an authoritative and reputable source. And those are the ones that I have here. I do have some links to some others at the end of this presentation. So this graphic pretty much just is an illustration of what we just discussed. So you have your hazards there on the left, things like fire, terrorism, workplace violence, utility outage, and then you have your assets in the middle, all of the things in the library that are valuable, and then all the way on the right, you have the impacts. So you have the things that could happen: property damage, injury, loss of confidence, and then of course legal penalties for some things that if you're not in compliance or if the library is found to have done something wrong. So let's talk a minute about mitigating risk. So as I mentioned, part of all of this, like if you look at this graphic and you see, okay, there are three blocks here. So the 4th block would be the mitigation block, right? And so mitigation is just essentially means you do what's possible to prevent the risk or prevent the adverse effect of the risk. So you can't prevent like a hurricane, right? But you can do what there are steps you can take to mitigate the damage a hurricane might cause, right? You can invest in special windows that have a very high break limit. You can invest in hurricane shutters. You can get flood insurance. You can, when I worked at the University of Miami, I was head of reference, and every hurricane season I would spend a large amount of time wrapping and unwrapping stacks in Visclean, which is a form of kind of heavy plastic. and take all of the books off the lower shelves and put them on the top shelves, so that if the expectation of 3 feet of flooding or storm surge, all of the books on the bottom would go on the top. So, we would spend like probably 3 or 4 days ahead of a hurricane, doing this mitigation, and 9 times out of 10, the hurricane wouldn't hit, and then we just have to go back and put everything back. But the risk of not doing that and then having the library flood was much worse than the time spent doing it and not having, for quote unquote nothing. So some of the common mitigation things are things like insurance, having a good relationship with certain experts. And this can differ, again, depending on the risks that are most likely for your library. Always your attorney, right? Always your attorney. Because sometimes if you have a question about, well, we only have so much money and we can only do certain things. So of all of these risks and all of these mitigations, what are the ones that are more important for me to spend my money on? And those are the kinds of things that your attorney and your insurance expert can help you make those kinds of decisions. For things like financial forensics and ensuring that your financial procedures and processes are appropriate. You would be surprised how many libraries don't have really clearly set out financial policies, and what they call, which just went out of my head. There are certain things you put in place, policies that you put in place as part of your financial policies to prevent fraud, right? And when you have an audit, they look at some of that, but they don't really do a deep look into it. So if you have never done it, it's probably a good idea to pull out your financial policies and really take a hard look at it to make sure, is the library doing what we can to mitigate any kind of financial fraud or loss? And it's not about, well, I think my employees are going to steal, or we think the director isn't trustworthy, or the board. It's just about mitigating that risk. And the better you are at mitigating that risk, the better it is overall for your library, right? Because then if something does happen down the road, it's not because you weren't watching the store, right? It's not because of something that the library didn't do, right? And that's going to help you with things like liability, or even maybe a state or local penalty. MIOSHA, right? You've been dealing with MIOSHA the whole pandemic. Y'all know what MIOSHA is. Well, MIOSHA is another way of mitigating risks, right? So that's workplace risk. Again, we're back to like, are all your shelves adequately bolted down? I've been in even big academic libraries where their shelves are not bolted to the floor. And you had some of those shelves have huge amounts. I mean, we're talking thousands of pounds of books. And, if something were to happen and one of those were to tip, it could create quite a problem. So, I've been in libraries where mostly, again, academic libraries, where someone puts a book on the shelf and pushes it too hard and the shelf of books on the other side falls down on you. That's also could be a risk. Book trucks that tip over could be a risk. So, is the library responsible for preventing any kind of accident? No. Like I said, it's a balance. But you want to be able to know which ones are the ones that are the important ones, and the ones that you could really hurt somebody, right? Because the number one thing is to not have any human injury, right? And that could not severely harm your physical assets and could not severely harm your reputation, right? So it's a sliding scale. Nobody can prevent everything. So it's about doing what you can. Making sure you're legally compliant with all of those things you have to be compliant with. Luckily, with libraries, there's a bunch of things, but it's not a huge amount of legal compliance. Privacy, as I said, workplace safety, employment things are all, the constitutional things. Those are all things that you want to make sure that you're in compliance with. You have, your policy implementation. Again, you're talking about, is the policy being implemented correctly? Make sure you don't have employees who maybe have certain biases, and so they are enforcing policies in an unfair way. Maybe they realize they are, maybe they don't realize they are, but whether they realize it or not doesn't help the library if you get sued. And again, that's not totally uncommon in libraries. There are, complaints and made against libraries all the time for things like biased behavior. Training, you want to make sure, training is a huge mitigating factor. Make sure that your staff is trained, the board is trained, the director is trained, not only in all your policies, but also in, the legal compliance issues. What do you have to do? What kinds of things is your library required to have? And again, going back to the financial policies, what kinds of things should your library have that maybe you don't have because you just never thought about it or you just never had it? And then also an awareness, it's about kind of pricking up your ears and being aware that, there are hazards and that, there are these risks. And as you're walking through your library, maybe have an eye towards, okay, what is a risk? Do I see a risk? And if I do, if I identify a risk, what can I do about it? So here's an example of a kind of a risk assessment. So if we talk about technology and cyber crime and data security. So if we look at the hazards, what are the hazards relating to data security and cybercrime? Well, you have data mining, right, where people go in and try to steal information out of your networks. You have identity theft. You have unauthorized access to patron information. So that could be someone who has no business going into the system to see who checked out what. Or it could be someone who is looking at hold slips that, maybe they shouldn't. You have piracy of intellectual property. So again, that's kind of the peer-to-peer sharing of movies and of streaming things that the library makes available. So it's the misuse of that. Maybe it could also be a violation of licensing terms. The use of library Wi-Fi for criminal purposes. There's not a huge amount you can do about that other than making sure that you have some kind of authentication so that there may be a way to trace someone who's doing something they shouldn't be doing. Hacking. Things like Zoom bombing or bombing. Again, when I was working in an academic setting, we had a situation where a student, someone was interfering with the Webpack, the online catalog, and they would default it to a really, really explicit image. And so when the catalog went to rest, so that, if you were a patron, you were just going up to use the catalog, instead of our welcome page, it would be this really disgusting image. And no matter, what we did, we kept taking it off and it would keep going back on until we finally figured out what was going on and we were able to lock it down. Denial of service attacks. Which is, when someone bombards your system and effectively shuts it down. Unfiltered sexual content to minors, which is an issue particularly with the Library Privacy Act and with SIPA. So if you have E-rate and you're required to have filters because of SIPA, then not having those filters or having filters that are not adequate can put you at risk for a violation of SIPA. So then we look at what are the assets at risk? Well, your data, right, and your network security, the private information, which could lead to You know, things like the Library Privacy Act, the Identity Theft Protection Act, as well as employment information, which could impact certain employment laws, your intellectual property assets, the services that you have, your, you know, the service you provide, right? So you want to make sure that your service isn't interrupted. And then again, your E-rate. So then the impacts on this are you can get penalties for violation of these laws, like the Library Privacy Act and the Identity Theft Protection Act. You can be liable to individuals whose data gets stolen and misused. You have harm to your patrons, right? Harm in all different ways. So that could be either identity theft, or it could be you have, you know, kids who are exposed to images that they're not supposed to be exposed to in terms of the SIPA issue. Halt of your services and of library operations. It could be staff, job, or salary loss, right? So that if you end up with a large lawsuit, or you have staff that are not properly trained, or staff who, you know, violate some of these laws or some of these things, then you could end up with a staff who loses their job. You could end up with having to close the library for a while, and then the staff isn't able to make money. And then you can have loss of community trust, right? So then you have a community, if you have your patron information taken, then you can have a whole wide range of people who are harmed for different reasons. So it could be not just financial reasons, not just identity theft, but it could also be people who find out what people are reading. So it could be a loss of some constitutional rights, or a loss of their perceived freedom to look at that information. And it could be obviously a financial cost, because we all know that if you get caught by these copyright holders of having, you know, being a library where stuff is stolen all the time and you're not taking the adequate risk mitigation or adequate steps to protect it, you can be heavily fined by these content holders, content owners, for the IP theft. So that's just kind of an example of a risk analysis for something that's happening right now, is in terms of the data. So then how do you mitigate this? Well, you could have a network security audit, right? You could talk to your IT person about, okay, can we bring in somebody, or are you capable of really looking at our system and flagging all of the areas that we need to improve, or all of the things that need tweaking or updating to make sure that it's as secure as possible. You may need to have policies that limit internally the access to certain systems to only certain employees, right? We have that at the state. You know, not everybody can get into everything, right? You only get into the things that you need to do your job. Other technology policies, if your staff each have their own individual device, then there are certain policies that may need to be put in place for those devices. How can they be used? Where can they be taken? Can they be used on an unsecured Wi-Fi? The laptop I'm talking to you right now on is a state laptop. I have very strict rules on what I can and cannot use it for, right? I cannot connect it to, not supposed to go to Starbucks and connect to an unsecure network. So there are certain things that, you know, by being given this laptop to work from home, there are certain responsibilities that I have. I have an iPad given to me by the state, but on that iPad are apps that the state monitors what I do on it. And so I can't just use it for, you know, ultimate solitaire or Animal Crossing. I am, you know, they have an eye. I can't just do all my shopping on it. It has a Verizon account on it. So I can't, like, you know, take it on, you know, some vacation someday and use it for something I shouldn't. In policy, agreements for patron access. So if you are, you know, going to be, if you have patrons that use your, you know, may ask for help, and now especially remotely, where, you know, they want you to view their screen. Well, you might want to make sure that there are agreements that, there's system, there are different programs you can put in place that require the patron to give explicit permission for you to view their screen. And again, that protects the library from, invasion of privacy accusation, or if you happen to become in possession of certain personal information of the patron because you viewed their screen. Making sure that the patrons understand the limits of access for the information. If a patron doesn't know that they shouldn't be streaming illegal content on, through the library Wi-Fi, then, they're going to do it. So they need to know, okay, by the statement that says, by logging into our Wi-Fi, you agree to X, like a click-through license. That's a mitigation strategy. And then, seeing something, saying something. So making sure the staff understands that if they see something, right? Because staff can be a lot of, great eyes and ears on the ground. So if your staff sees something that doesn't look quite right, you want to empower them to be able to, if they see something, to say something in case, about something that doesn't look quite right, as a way of mitigating suspicious activity. You want to make sure that, again, staff understand how to enforce policy. You want to make sure your devices are kept updated with the most recent software and the most recent security fixes and patches and things that various programs need. You want to make sure that your patrons have to authenticate to get into remote access, either by like an easy proxy or an IP system, or where they actually have to log in and put in their library card. You want to review your licenses. Make sure that your licenses for the products that you purchase for the library network, and any vendor contracts, like for your ILS or for your, ILL system or cataloging system, that any vendor that is going to have access to any kind of patron data or any kind of library data understands that they are under the same responsibility that you are for making sure that that data is protected. That's part of the new Library Privacy Act. That means that, your vendor is as much liable for a breach of that data as you are. And so it's important that they understand that they have to safeguard that data. And then you may want to consider cyber insurance, right? So, which would protect you in the event of a breach. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about crisis management. So crisis management picks up from risk management, right? So risk management is about identification and mitigation. Crisis management is about detailed preparation for specific crises, for specific events, and the actual management of those events when they occur, as well as the recovery of the library from those events. Now, one important thing to know about crisis management, which is something we also talked a little bit about with risk, is that crises can come in all sizes, right? So a lot of times, when you hear the term crisis management, you think big things, right? So one example, obviously, is the pandemic that we're in right now. That's a big crisis. You have, you created a plan, right? Your pandemic plan is a perfect example of a crisis management plan, right? It indicated, revised and amended policies. It encouraged you to change current policies to go along with the pandemic and to help facilitate operation in the pandemic. It provided some of them, some libraries created pandemic plans that provided emergency powers to the director. In other words, enabled the director to do some things that normally they may have had to confer with the board on, things like closing the library, things like amending policies on the fly. And that's a very important thing. And then also the idea of staged recovery. So that's a perfect example of what we're talking about when we're talking about crisis management. You come up with a plan. So you have the plan, and hopefully you're able to do a plan in advance. We all got kind of blindsided by this right now. And then, what the plan does is the plan facilitates the ability of the management of the library and the staff of the library to continue operations within the crisis and kind of manage all of the individual components that are a part of that, including making sure the staff are taken care of, making sure that the assets of the library are protected, making sure that the patrons, to the extent possible, are able to get services, and also provided for a staged recovery where things come back bit by bit. So some other examples of crises, which are maybe a little bit smaller than a giant pandemic, but are the same kinds of things that you would think of them in the same way as the pandemic as far as a crisis management perspective, but kind of just scaled down, right? So things like bed bugs, right? So there are libraries that, get hit with bed bugs and they'd never had them before, and it becomes a complete surprise. Well, now that's becoming more of if not already, a common thing. And so libraries should have some kind of thing in place to what if we get bed bugs? What do we do? Biohazard accidents. And this is actually just kind of a nice way of saying, you have a toddler that has an accident on the floor, or you have an adult that has an accident on the floor, which happens, so what do you do about that? Especially nowadays where you're also concerned about the pandemic part of it. So, how do you handle when there's some kind of biohazard or some kind of, again, it's not a huge thing, but it's a mini crisis that you have to know how to deal with, right? There are certain things that have to be done correctly, right? A pair of gloves, a plastic bag, but you have to be able to have them. You cordon off the section, you keep other patrons away. So there are things that have to be, you use certain cleaners. So there are things that still, it has to be addressed in a certain way. The whole opioid thing, if you're someone who overdosing, Narcan, that's a mini crisis. Other medical emergencies, someone has a heart attack or a stroke, or someone, a staff member injures themselves. Those are all medical emergencies that require some kind of crisis management, right? It's not huge crisis management, but it is crisis management. The next three are things that are a little bit harder. So board discord, staff discord, and patron discord. Nowadays, more and more, I can tell you that about 3 out of every 5 calls I get and emails have to do with staff or board discord. Either boards arguing with themselves, arguing with their municipalities, arguing with their director, the director arguing with the board, the director arguing with their staff, the staff arguing with each other, the staff arguing with the board. It is rampant right now. And so these can become crises, right? So if you have a board that becomes so dysfunctional or becomes so wrapped up in a dispute or a disagreement where they're not performing their job, or they're starting to, split the staff into factions and the community into factions, that becomes a crisis. It can become a crisis. It even can become a big crisis, because if board members start to quit and you end up without a quorum, then you have big problems because you can't spend money. Your municipality could end up stepping in and taking over the library until the board is restored. So it can cause, these things can kind of deteriorate and turn into very big crises. And then, communities get involved, and that can affect, again, your reputation and your trust between your community and the library. So one example of crisis management and risk assessment that may be a good exercise is to consider, what would happen if civility and communication and working relationships started to fall apart within your board or your staff. So how do you handle these kinds of discord in terms of, doing the best that you can to prevent it affecting the operation of the library and the trust between the library and the community. And then that can happen with patron discord too. A lot of you have had experience with that with masks, right? So mitigating patron discord and political discord. Some of you have had some real on-the-job training with that. And so, that's another thing that's important. And that can also be a part of policy enforcement, right? How is staff enforcing policy? Is there a way to enforce it in a manner that would reduce that discord? And I know there was a lot of conflict mitigation training and de-acceleration training, and those are all excellent things to look at when you're talking about crisis management and risk assessment and risk management. Are things like that de-acceleration training for your staff. How do you take a hot situation and bring it down? Again, when I worked in academia, we would have around exam time, we would have students that would actually come to fist fights over study rooms. And over things like copiers and scanners and textbooks that were on reserve. And I myself have had things where I've had to physically insert myself between two 20-something law students who were trying to go at each other. So how do you manage those kinds of crises? Again, not major crises, but they can turn into major crises, because if one takes a swing at another or one injures the other, well, now you have to call the police, and then it becomes a much bigger thing. Financial hardship. What do you do if the library is struggling money-wise and you have to lay people off? Or you have to severely cut your budget and cut services? How do you handle that with the staff and with the members of the public in order to maintain your library's good reputation and good relationship with the public and with your staff, and not cause staff that maybe are not downsized? How do you keep the morale of that staff to the point where they can adequately operate the library? And this is really difficult. I've been in this situation too. One of the worst experiences of my professional life was having to drive around this state and lay people off. And it was awful. And it talk about trauma. It was just awful. And so how would you manage that if that is a situation that might be coming up? So putting together your crisis, your disaster plan. So many of you should already have a disaster plan, right? And again, just like a risk management, it can be done either individually per perceived crisis. So, if in your risk management, you say, okay, well, hurricanes or freezing pipes and ice storms, that's a risk management. So from the risk management point of view, we identify it, we have insurance, we do the best we can to make sure our pipes are insulated, that we have a generator, we have effective, but then the crisis management would be, okay, who has the keys to the generator? Who has the ability to determine that the generator gets turned on? How many staff have to be on premises in order to make sure that the generator is operating properly? Who decides what gets hooked up to the generator? So these are all, that would be the crisis plan. So a lot of the crisis plan is that preparation, and a lot of that preparation, sometimes it sits on the line between risk management and crisis management. So some of this preparation, like purchasing of equipment, could be risk management, but things like policies and procedures and making sure appropriate staff is in place, and creating a crisis team, which could be administrative staff or your management team Or if you're a small library, it could be the board and the director. It could just be one board member and the director and maybe a staff person. You know, who are the people that are going to be most available in a crisis? So, you know, if you have staff members that are responsible for very young children or responsible for older or disabled people, maybe, you know, they may not be the people to be on your actual on the ground disaster team. It doesn't mean that if they're available, they can't help. It means that, you know, you come up with your core group of people that are most likely to be available no matter what that crisis is. For some smaller crises, the people you want to include would be supervisors that, you know, are in charge during different schedules. So your supervisor that's in charge at night when you know, maybe the director isn't there, or the weekends. So you want to make sure they're involved also, because you can never know when a crisis is going to happen. So you want to make sure that the staff that need to know and the staff that are going to be responsible for being on the ground in crises or disasters know what to do and have access to the materials they may need. So that means access to a particular closet or access to, you know, wherever the materials are stored. And again, things like keys to the generator. You want to make sure that, you know, you look at investing in certain necessary tools. And again, this could also be risk management. You know, does your team have laptops or devices that would enable them to do some work at home if that became a necessary thing? Again, we just dealt with that. And then, you know, what about things like maintaining certain necessary requirements? Right now, we have some libraries that are in a bind because their budgets have to be approved before the end of their fiscal year, and they have boards that aren't having board meetings. And so there's more than, you know, there's a few libraries that are in that position right now. So, you know, you have to have a plan in place. Like, if your board doesn't meet, how are you gonna, you know, get your budget passed? What are the ways that your board could get that done? And then look at your policies, and you may have to, and again, these are things that many of you have already been through, altering your procedures and policies. You know, staff leave and benefits. You know, again, you have staff that, you know, are ill, or staff that are injured, or staff that, you know, if it's a big disaster, their house just was destroyed and they're in no condition to come to work. You know, what do? Do they get unpaid leave? Do they get paid leave? Do they maintain their benefits? What about the library paying bills, or they're, you know, maintaining their budget? You know, if the library director right now does not have enough authority to approve money over a certain amount, maybe there needs to be some kind of contingency document that gives the director that permission when there is a certain kind of crisis, so that bills can continue to be paid. You know, again, and like we said, emergency authority on the ground. Who can the director open and close the library? Can the director expend money? Can the director amend or create reasonable policies and procedures, including hiring temporary staff or filling empty positions from staff who maybe can no longer come into work for a certain amount of time because they're dealing with other things on their own relating to whatever the crisis or disaster is? Does the director have the authority to work and communicate with municipal and or emergency personnel or other partners in the city or township, or even in the state? So these are all things that should be in some sort of document relating to crisis management, because these are the kinds of things you don't want to have to deal with when you're in the midst of a crisis. Again, as many of you realize, because it has happened in the current crisis. A communication plan is extremely important. In fact, I think that if you don't remember anything else from this, remembering that training is important and remembering that a communication plan is key. Make sure that for purposes of crisis, a spokesperson is designated. And so this is the person that would talk to the media, would talk to the members of the public, the person that is responsible with communicating a consistent message. You can't have every board member talking to the media, saying different things in any kind of a crisis, whether it's a smaller crisis like bed bugs or it's a big crisis. You have to have one person that is consistently giving a uniform response and a consistent response that is in line with your brand and with your mission and your relationship with your community. Because again, you need to maintain that trust and relationship with your community. You want to designate a social media person. They could be the same person, but someone who is skilled with social media, who is able, what if you have something embarrassing that goes viral? You have an unfortunate board meeting where someone loses it, or like the one recently in Grand Rapids or Traverse City, not the library one, but the city one where the guy pulled out a gun. That the video could go viral and it could have a negative impact on your reputation. Do you have someone on your staff who is good with social media, who would know how to maybe spin that or how to reduce the impact of that viral video? If necessary, in your back pocket, somewhere in your communication plan, do some research and find a good PR firm or a good publicist, and just keep the name there so that if you have a situation that gets really bad, you know someone you can call to help if it comes to that. Communicate. Again, you want to make sure that you have a consistent message going, and that's not just with members of the public, but with staff too. Make sure that you have someone who's communicating with staff, that knows where all the staff are. If someone is, AOL, make sure that, the staff is being told, the things they need to know to adequately make decisions. Make sure someone is communicating with the whole board. A lot of times the board president gets all the information, and for whatever reason, sometimes they're not as good at communicating it out. Maybe they're dealing with their own things having to do with the emergency. Maybe there's no cell service. Maybe there's no electricity. Make sure that someone has authority and someone is consistently communicating with any primary partners, emergency management, municipality, law enforcement, and patrons. That can go back up to your social media, and the local media, right? That again would be the spokesperson, and your insurance company. Okay, so who is in charge of talking to the insurance company? You could have, one person who is the spokesperson for the library, one person who's in charge of talking with the insurance company and the attorney. You can break this up into different people, and then those people need to talk to each other. And then what about things like notification that there is a crisis? And this is really more important with those smaller crises. What system do you have in place so that, if there's something happening in the library, again, from a risk management perspective, is your staff trained to recognize things before they happen? Do you have security guards and security cameras? Who can call law enforcement? Can any staff member call law enforcement, or is there a particular procedure? Is the director who tells the security guards, what they can do or what they're responsible for? If you hire security guards from an outside agency and you have a contract with them, it's that contract that governs what they do. And so make sure that the director understands what that contract says. What is the security guard authorized to do, and what are they not authorized to do? Because depending on the contract, if the security guard is not supposed to do something, then they may not see or they may not be able to participate in a crisis that may come up. So these are all things you want to consider when you're doing your communication plan. A training plan, and again, this is incredibly important. Regular training. Make sure your staff and the director gets regular training as much as possible. To the extent that you're able to, cross-train your staff in essential operations. You should have more than one person that knows how to restart the network. You should have more than one person that knows how your ILS works. to make sure that if there is an emergency and if there is some kind of crisis, that there is more than one person that can help get that back up and running, because the one person that knows how to do it may not be able to come into the office. And policies, we've been talking about policies. Make sure that everybody knows what the policies are. And if they change, make sure everybody knows about it. In terms of your emergency policies, make sure everybody is aware of evacuation plans and procedures. Have a Narcan policy if your library is going to carry that. It's always good to have someone on the staff that knows CPR, that is aware of how an EpiPen is used, that knows first aid, including wound first aid, which is like shooter first aid, how to handle heavy bleeding. There are classes that you can take on that. There are online classes you can take on that show you how to deal with someone that's been shot. Crisis identification. Does someone know what a bed bug looks like? Does someone know, is you have someone on your staff that can recognize when someone is carrying a weapon? Is there someone on your staff that understands the difference between someone who may have an emotional issue and someone who could present a violence threat? So it's important that each of these things can be a very good crisis management and a risk mitigation strategy. And there's lots of training programs out there that are even free. So what about recovery? The recovery plan. So part of crisis management is having a plan for getting back to normal, right? And recovering as much as possible. So staff recovery is a big deal, and trauma is an even bigger deal. Trauma help. Even you would be surprised that even with the smallest crisis is dealing with interpersonal conflict, right? So those kind of, board problems or staff problems can have enormous ripple effects on staff, enormous trauma effects. And then as the disaster or the crisis gets bigger, the trauma gets bigger. And trauma sometimes is not immediately visible on people, right? Right now, I think everyone recognizes that this past year has inflicted trauma on a lot of people, and I think a little bit on everybody. And so it's important particularly for managers and directors and boards to understand that trauma and understand what they can do to help mitigate that trauma and deal with that trauma in order to help their staff in order to get to the point where the library is back to operating optimally and operating in a manner that is best for its community and its assets. And I think one very important thing to recognize is not everybody experiences the same trauma. Continued communication with the media and municipal leaders and community. Keep talking to them. Here's what we have available. Here's what we need. And here is how we are able to help. There are lots of articles out there, and I posted a couple in the resources about how libraries can be particularly helpful in crises. So helpful to their community, not just with the library dealing with the crisis itself, but the library helping others deal with the crisis. You want to make sure that you anticipate, to the extent that you can in your crisis management document, that what kind of in your recovery plan, what kind of construction needs could you have for that particular crisis, and then keep names of contractors, plumbers, other kinds of professionals in your recovery plan, so that when the crisis occurs, you can call that person, because if it's a big enough crisis, everyone else is going to be calling them too. And if you can get a jump on it by not having to waste time going, oh, who do I call? Then you may be able to get your bid in early, and you may be able not be sitting in line for too long. And then also remember things like restoration. Again, this can even be for tiny crises, like, if something, you get like roof leaks and something gets damaged. Pack a little bin somewhere with little samples of your upholstery for your library furniture, your carpet swatch, your paint swatch. So that way, if you have to say get a repaint your ceiling, you know what the color was that was there. If you have a particular type of shelving, and if you know what that shelving was, what the maker and what the serial number was, then it's going to be easier for you to replace things in the correct color. Even if you get it on the secondary market, you're going to have a leg up on knowing exactly what you need in order to get you back to where you were. And so with a little bit of work up front and a little bit of planning, you can have this kind of just this little thing all ready to go, that then you're not scrambling at the last minute. The serial numbers and information on other equipment like your computers and some of the more expensive parts of your collection, if you have a library of things. And you may want to keep a separate document, and you can even for now keep it in like an Excel sheet, and then once a month you print off the Excel sheet and you put it in a folder in case there's a problem where you can't get to your computer. Or in other libraries I've worked at, we've had people take something like a flash drive home with this information on it, so that if something happened at the library, someone had the information off site. And then as usual, plan for a gradual reopening, which a lot of you already are doing. So some of this, as I said, is going to sound very familiar to you. The last thing I want to talk about is planning for the unexpected. So everything we've talked to up to now really are talking about identifiable and expected kinds of crises. So the kinds of crises you can anticipate. So weather or workplace violence, things that we know are out there that we can say, okay, the library should have a contingency plan on this. But then there's those ones that just kind of creep up on you. And a lot of this, again, has to do with interpersonal problems, scandals, things that are unexpected, right? Again, kind of the bed bug issue, the staff, maybe there's a relationship, a prior relationship between two members of the library community, in a particular library that wasn't known, and it flares up and it maybe turns into violence. There's all kinds of things out there. So, this kind of tagline that we have here at Library of Michigan is, it's not a problem till it's a problem. So one of the ways you can plan for the unexpected is to build your brand. And that's, again, the reputation of your library, right? So as many of you are, if not all of you, right now you have an established relationship with your community. And in the large majority of circumstances, you have trust. So, do what you can to maintain that and build on it. Make sure that you're transparent, right? You're following the Open Meetings Act. That is another law that is important as far as risk management. Make sure that you are in compliance with all of the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act, that you're keeping the documents you should keep, that your board is handling meetings in the way they should handle it, that meeting minutes are open and available, because the more transparent you are, the more that inspires that trust. Review your policies, right? All your policies. That should be a regular process. I know that, time is fleeting and not everybody has time to do everything, but your policies are important. And reviewing them with an eye towards crisis is important. Make sure, again, that your policies as far as risk management and crisis management include clear authority for the director, right? Because if those lines are blurred, it becomes very difficult, because the director really is most likely the one who's going to be on the ground. And making sure that person has the authority that they need to make certain decisions is really important. important, and you can contact your attorney about that. Your board can talk to your attorney about that. What's appropriate? How is it done correctly? I highly recommend that. Make sure you form your crisis team. And what's nice about some of this is that if you already have a disaster plan and you have documents from the pandemic, you know, you can create this a la carte policies, right? So that, you know, you can have policies that can be interchanged with any crisis. So you can have a policy that says, okay, the director has X authority, you know, in circumstances where, you know, the life of is that there could be life is imperiled or property could be damaged. You know, there are ways to take these policies and have them, like I said, a la carte, so that when those unexpected crises come up, people are prepared, and you can say, oh, okay, wait, we have bed bugs. Okay, I know that in a crisis that where there could be significant economic damage, or there could be significant damage to the library brand, the director has the authority to, you know, close the library for a thorough, you know, extermination by the, you know, pest exterminator. The library has the director has the authority to invoke a quarantine on documents. The library director has the authority to post information on the library website to the public regarding the bed bug issue. So that way they're not having to go back and forth to the board constantly. Do they need to notify the board? Absolutely. But to the extent that the director and some members of the staff are empowered to deal with things quickly, it's going to really mitigate the amount of damage ultimately that the library has. Again, training is so important. So here are some training resources, and there's a lot here. And there's even more. Here are some general resources, and it's tiny because there are a lot. And here's even more. So there are, you know, a lot of things out there to help you. I know this is a lot of information and it's kind of overwhelming, but I think just, you know, to sum up, what's important is that you know the difference between risk management and crisis management. That, you know, it's in your mind that, you know, if I don't have a risk management policy, maybe I should look into doing one. And if I don't have, you know, if I have a disaster plan, but I haven't looked at it in a really long time, maybe I need to pull that out and take a look at it with an eye towards, you know, this idea of crisis management and this idea of not only protecting the physical assets, but also protecting the library's reputation and the library's brand, and with an eye towards applying these also to some of those smaller crises that could occur. Well, I thank you once again for everybody for listening to me. It is 11:24. I'm going to see if there is, I don't see anything on chat. I'm going to actually stop my share. Okay, there's everybody. And I don't see any questions. So I want to thank everyone for being here. If there's anything, if you have a question or a suggestion, please fill out the survey that is in the, that Becky just put in the chat here. And please, if there's a topic that you would like us to address on the monthly webinars that we have not been addressing, please don't hesitate to do that, because I'm always interested in knowing what people want to talk about. Remember, in March 16th, we have another Library Privacy Act webinar with MLA and with Ann Surink, where we're going to build on the one we had last month. And we also have some trustee training, another series of the two-part trustee training is going to also occur in March. So don't forget, if you would tell your board about that, that'd be great. And I hope everybody has a really great rest of your day.